You are listening to KLRN Radio, where liberty and reason still reign.
Most writers and radio show hosts know that to connect with your fans, you need to do more than just write books or record the latest podcasts. There are many different elements that go into forming an online platform, but there are also many hidden traps. To make matters worse, solid advice on how to survive the muddy waters is scarce. In the book Hidden Traps, I talk about some of the important issues of working with an online platform, highlighting traps that could put your physical or internet security at risk or be harmful to your reputation. Are your social media posts just links with a few disjointed words, making you look like someone who can't complete a sentence? Did your new website cost you more than you anticipated? Are you leaking your personal contact details across the web without even knowing it? Then you need Hidden Traps. Hidden Traps is now available in paperback and ebook from a variety of retailers, including Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Kobo. Visit blackwolfpublications.com for more details.
Do you need a car? Been shopping only to be turned down because of bad credit, low credit, no credit, bankruptcy, or divorce? Guess what? Today's your lucky day, because now you can buy a car, truck, or SUV, just about any vehicle. It's true. Bad credit doesn't matter. No credit doesn't matter. Bankruptcy or divorce, it just doesn't matter. As a matter of fact, your job is your ticket to your new vehicle. We're Auto Credit Express, and we've helped thousands of people just like you. Antonio H. told us, great company, got me connected, and the day I went in, I drove off in the car I wanted. 100% worth your time. Need a car? Get started now and drive off as early as today. Just text FINANCE, FINANCE, to 357-911 right now to get started. That's FINANCE, FINANCE, to 357-911. Auto financing the easy way. Text FINANCE to 357-911.
KLRN Radio has advertising rates available. We have rates to fit almost any budget. Contact us at advertising@klrnradio.com.
Everyone loves liberty. Our rights come from God, not the government. So why are you letting other people tell you what's best for your healthcare? Exercise your freedom with Liberty Health Share. Liberty Health Share is a community of people who voluntarily share one another's medical costs. Liberty Health Share is founded on the idea that most people truly want to help one another. Healthcare sharing allows members to do just that as a true community that supports one another in times of need. Liberty believes people should make decisions for themselves and their families. Members are able to take back the freedom to make their own decisions about their healthcare. Freedom from guilt or doubt about how your money is used. You have the freedom to direct your healthcare, not to be dictated to by bureaucrats. Stop letting others tell you what to do and join a community of like-minded people. Exercise your freedom. Join Liberty Health Share and take back the control of your healthcare while helping those around you. Call Liberty at 855-58-LIBERTY. Again, that's 855-58-LIBERTY for more information, or you can check them out at libertyhealthshare.org. Again, that's libertyhealthshare.org.
My son was in the Army back during Desert Storm, but even then he wanted an MBA. He looked at a dozen schools, but only one offered the online education and flexibility he needed while he was in a tent in Iraq. Grantham University. Turns out that Grantham's been delivering affordable, relevant college and advanced degrees for over 65 years. Heck, if they can deliver a quality education to a soldier in a tent overseas, think about the flexibility Grantham can offer you so you can earn your degree too. It doesn't matter how complicated or full your life is. If getting a degree is on your bucket list, you'll want to do what my son did. You'll want to call Grantham. Find out how easy it is to get started on your education so you can check that college degree off your bucket list. Call Grantham right now, 800-910-1370. That's 800-910-1370. Flexible, affordable, relevant. Call 800-910-1370.
At St. Jude, a family never sees a bill at all. It's like the world has been lifted off of your shoulders.
St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. Finding cures, saving children. Learn more at stjude.org.
Sometimes writers feel lost, unsure why a passage may not be working. takes another set of eyes to help us nurture our writing into full maturity. At Black Wolf Editorial Services, we strive to enable writers to develop and grow, offering manuscript critiques and line edits through a mentoring editorial style. We also offer assistance on generating a writer's bio for your websites. Black Wolf Editorial Services, nurturing your writing into maturity. For a full list of services, visit blackwolfeditorial.com.
You're listening to the Spark Radio Network, internet radio like you've never heard before. Innovation, creativity, and imagination are all said to begin with a spark. So fasten your seatbelt and take the ride of your life and listen for the spark.
Good evening, everybody. You are listening to For Immediate Release. It is Tuesday, February 11th. I should know that day. It's my wedding anniversary. This is Bill O'Reilly. I am here tonight without Liz Neuerfeld, who is traveling the country. I think she's somewhere over Dallas or some thereabouts. Thank you for joining us tonight. We actually have a really cool show. Liz normally carries this podcast, so I thought we better have some good people on. And so I have invited one of my dearest friends in the world, who is an author from Peoria, Illinois, former scout for the Chicago Cubs pitching back in the day, but a wonderful author who has written 2 books, and he'll talk probably mostly about one today. The second book he read about was about my father, which was very, very nice. But we are joined tonight by Tim Plekovich. Tim from Peoria, how are you doing tonight?
Bill, I'm doing terrifically well. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. It's so good to be with you.
And Tim, I promoted you. I just went on Twitter and I promoted you. I made huge promises. I told people that anyone who is interested in American history will have their minds blown tonight. And I actually believe that to be the case. And then Tim is inviting on a guest in our second half that will blow it even further.
Yes.
But first, let's just jump right into it. And, you know, an hour is not going to even be enough time, Tim. I could have you on this line for 3 hours. And you've got...
Oh, my gosh, Billy, when you and I get together, we can just talk forever and ever. I mean, that's so true. But I think it'll be pretty easy being able to fill 60 minutes worth of time here. So
I don't think. I mean, you are truly one of America's great conversationalists, and the number of things that you know about American history and other history for that matter, but just little details that I hadn't known, and I consider myself a kind of a closet semi-scholar, and you just blow me away with things that you've come up with. But could you talk first, because we're approaching Lincoln's birthday this week?
Yes.
Could you talk first about your first book, Civil War Fathers, which got really well received, and I saw a lot of the news coverage off of it,
yes.
And some of the television clips from it. But could you tell us, Civil War Fathers, how that came to be and what that's about?
Bill, I'll try to encapsulate it for you. It is rather lengthy. I would like to start out, Billy, by just prefacing this and saying to you that I gave up a long time ago telling people about my good friend whose dad knew both President Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. I had some pretty strange looks when I would say that. But that was so true. Yeah, that was so true. The gentleman whom I'm referring to just passed away just a few weeks ago, Bill, at the age of 97. His dad, and I'll get into the format of the book in just a moment, but I just wanted to mention this gentleman, Fred Upham, who passed away at the age of 97 in Fort Collins, Colorado. His dad was appointed to West Point by President Lincoln in the middle of the Civil War. And so after graduating from West Point in 1866, he, of course, had to serve the obligatory 4 years in the American Army, and he was sent to a place called Fort Monroe, Virginia, where Jefferson Davis was being held after the Civil War, Jefferson Davis and his family. So here's a gentleman who was appointed to West Point by President Lincoln, actually knew him, had multiple visits with him during the Civil War, and then he ends up being at Fort Monroe, Virginia, where Jefferson Davis is being incarcerated, and he ends up serving guard duty over Jefferson Davis for an 18-month period for 12-hour shifts. So he knew President Lincoln and intimately knew the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis. Isn't that just wild?
Yeah, it's wild, but also he didn't start as he was in West Point, but he was really a grunt, for a later terminology. Wasn't he? He was just a combat veteran. He didn't come from any aristocracy or anything. And I think I remember wounded a couple of times, and Lincoln thought, let's get you into West Point to keep you out of the field for a little while.
Right. He was a non-com officer. He was a corporal at the time, Billy, and he was injured at the Battle of First Bull Run. He was left for dead. He was taken by Confederate soldiers to a makeshift field hospital, and after he was nursed as well as they could nurse him, in a few days he was sent to Libby Prison in Richmond, Virginia, where he was interned for several months and was released in the early part of 1862. And what worked to his benefit, Bill, was that this gentleman, this young man who was just 20 years old at the time, was from the same Wisconsin town as one of the United States senators at that time, a senator by the name of Doolittle. Well, this Doolittle knew the Upham family from Racine, Wisconsin, and so as it turned out, Doolittle, of course, was very, very interested in following Upham and wondering when he was going to be released. And so upon his release, he was intercepted by government officials at I'm trying to think of the name of it, Billy. It's at Camp Parole, Maryland, and they informed him that he was to go to Washington, D.C. to meet with Senator Doolittle. And upon his arrival in D.C. at the train station, Senator Doolittle proceeded to take Upham to the White House and a conversation with the three participants being President Lincoln, Senator Doolittle, and William Upham ensued. And so it was after that meeting. It was after that meeting that Lincoln was appointed, or Lincoln appointed young Upham to West Point. And it was wonderful, Billy, because from everything we know about this young man, he had a very engaging personality, the kind of personality that won Lincoln over. They quickly became very attached, and Lincoln just, he thought, my gosh, this young man has already been through so much at such a tender age. I'm going to offer him the chance to be discharged from the regular Union Army. He was with the 2nd Wisconsin Volunteers, which later became part of the Iron Brigade, and that's something, getting the discharge was something else that worked to his benefit, because as you know, Bill, the Iron Brigade was virtually decimated at the Battle of Gettysburg a couple years later. So this really worked to Upham's benefit to be released from regular Army duty and appointed to West Point.
Tim, I understand that then Upham later eulogized Jeff Davis, submitted a eulogy about Davis, which is just as his former jailer. I guess they became friends.
They did. And when you're with somebody, Billy, for about a year and a half, and you're spending 12-hour shifts with him in a very small cell, you get to know somebody pretty intimately. And there's just so much chess and checkers that one can play. And they had a lot of discourse and a lot of very, very interesting dialogue. And we can get into that a little bit later. And what I could do, Bill, is pull out for you, as I did a couple of weeks ago, that eulogy and read it to you. Really is kind of a bombshell eulogy in that it divulges some things about Jefferson Davis that most people are maybe unaware of.
And Tim, I feel bad just saying Upham. What was his final rank? I want to just properly address him. He was a colonel?
No, Billy. He would have been just simply a second lieutenant.
He was second lieutenant.
Yeah, he just served the obligatory 4 years in the American Army and went back to Wisconsin, became a magnate in the lumber industry in the state, and because of his heroic status as a Civil War veteran and appointee to West Point by President Lincoln, and the fact that he had done so well in the lumber industry, he was approached by the Republican Party late in the 19th century about running for governor. And he accepted, he won, served one term as governor of Wisconsin, did not like it really at all. He thought that it was just too many nefarious characters involved. So at the end of his first term, he simply told the folks that he had no intentions of running for re-election. He was going to go back into private life, and that's what he did. So he spent the last quarter century of his life in the lumber industry again. Yes, but sired two children. But he sired two children. He and his first wife were married, Bill, for about 45 years. She could not have children, and after her demise, which occurred in 1911, 3 years later, he remarried at the age of 73, and his second wife was 28 at the time. And so 2 years after that, because they didn't want to rush into anything, when he was 75 years old in 1916, he sired his first child. And then 5 years later, Fred, who just passed away on December 30th of last year, was sired when his dad was 80 years old in 1921.
Amazing. And Tim, all the characters in your book were World War II veterans whose fathers had served in the Civil War. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yes, as is the case with the Upham family. The two brothers both served, one in the American Army, one in the Navy, and the older Upham, Billy, was actually an officer to a General Weaver, who and they served in England prior to D-Day, in working heavily with the preparations for the landing on June 6, 1944. So just quite an interesting family. But Billy, you were wondering about how this all came to fruition, this book, and I do want to talk to you a little bit about that. I used to belong to an organization, Bill, called the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, and it's composed today mostly of people who would be either the great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, or great-great-great-grandsons of gentlemen who fought in the Union Army during the Civil War. Some of your listeners might remember the Grand Army of the Republic, which was the largest of the fraternal orders to which the different Union veterans themselves belonged to after the Civil War. And that was an organization that continued to last into the 1950s. Their last national encampment was in 1949, when I think a group of, at that time, just 5 or 6, maybe 7, Union veterans gathered in Indianapolis for a reunion. I believe the organization continued until 1956, when we had the last Union veteran who passed away, Bill, at the age of 106. And so when the Grand Army of the Republic ceased to exist, the organization that became to carry on the torch became the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, which had actually been established back in the 1880s. And so anyway, I went to a national encampment of the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War quite a few years ago, and I had a chance to meet a gentleman at that meeting who was the son of a Michigan cavalry soldier. And I thought, my gosh, wouldn't this be interesting for one of my middle school students in Peoria, Illinois? I was teaching middle school language arts and history at the time. I thought, wouldn't that be fascinating for one of my middle school students to correspond with this gentleman, this Ed Blakely, who was almost 99 at the time. And I thought, so as soon as I got home, Billy, this was in August, so the school year had not commenced. We were still pretty much in the middle of summer, and I contacted the student and I said, I have the perfect gentleman who would love to correspond with you. He's a 99-year-old gentleman whose dad fought in the Civil War. Well, this kid was incredulous. He couldn't believe it. When you say that to most people today, Bill, I guess a lot of people wouldn't raise eyebrows because they're so disengaged from history that it wouldn't mean anything. But I asked this particular student because he really was, a very cerebral kid. Well, he couldn't believe it that this gentleman could have had a dad who fought in the Civil War, regardless of how old he was. And so I explained to him that the man was very elderly when he sired this Mr. Blakely. Well, so he started to correspond with this gentleman. It went terrifically well. They had about 6 pieces of correspondence between them going back and forth prior to the commencement of the school year. I thought to myself, if this is going to work this well with these two, maybe the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War can supply me with a list of all of their known, identified, what they called real sons. And in other words, those other gentlemen who were living, whose dads had fought in the Civil War. Well, sure enough, they were able to supply me with a list of about 25 names. This worked out terrifically well because it was just enough. I guess there were about 30. So it was just a little more than enough for a class of about 28. So I started this at the beginning of the year just as a simple language arts exercise with the students. And we heard, Billy, from just about virtually every veteran. The only ones, or children of veterans, I should say, of the Civil War vets. I think we didn't hear from 3, but we did hear from either their spouse or a child or grandchild. As you can imagine, the attrition rate was pretty high. And so, unfortunately, 3 of the men, I guess, had passed away. But nevertheless, their family members were quick to comply with our requests and to give us as much information as they could about the fathers of these gentlemen to whom we were writing. So one day after class, Bill, several of the kids, about 10 of them from this one class, stayed after school with me, and most of them, by the way, were girls. I thought that was really interesting. It told me that they had enjoyed this so much that they wondered about the feasibility of continuing to correspond with these folks. And I was elated. I hadn't expected to get that kind of reception. And so I said, well, yeah. I said, that's kind of a dream for me. I said, I didn't want to push this on you guys. And they said, no, this is really cool. So the kids started corresponding with these 25 sons of Union soldiers, of Civil War soldiers. And in the meantime, these sons gave us the addresses of their sisters because they thought that we would probably like to extrapolate as much information from them as well. So that increased the pool of the number of people with whom we were corresponding to about 60. And so that was quite a lot of work, Billy, for these dozen or so kids, because on average, that meant that each of them was corresponding with about 5 different pen pals. And it was interesting because these kids this was in the early 2000s, Bill. This would have been in 2002, 2003, 2004. And what was interesting, the kids were doing all of this via conventional mail. And eventually, I'll never forget this gentleman. His dad had served with the Pennsylvania Cavalry Regiment during the Civil War. Very, very nice man, very interesting background himself. He had served as a radio operator in the Pacific in Okinawa. He finally wrote back after about the 3rd or 4th correspondence with one of the kids and said, I'm really enjoying, what you're doing because you're rekindling so many interesting memories about my life, my father's life, what I was doing as a kid, what I was doing during World War II. But he said, please, don't you know how to use email? He said, wouldn't it be so much more fun if we were to correspond via email? It would just expedite things so much. And so I thought that was so funny that here was the son of a Civil War soldier who wanted to do email.
Telling the high school kids to put the pens down.
Right. And so a number of the Civil War vets started to correspond via email. They were doing it themselves, or they had maybe a grandson or granddaughter or a daughter or son who was helping them on the computer. But a lot of them were doing it on their own. And but Bill, it was just the most interesting array of participants. And as serendipity would have it, one of the families involved was the family of this Governor Upham, who knew both President Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. And his two sons were two of the most receptive, two of the most eager participants. The eldest of the Upham sons, Bill, who passed away a few years ago at the age of 93, came to Peoria on several occasions to meet with his pen pals and to honor the memory of his father at different Memorial Day programs which we had in the city. And most of the folks who ended up being part of the book, Bill, ended up coming to Peoria and participating in at least one of those programs. We were fortunate to have one family of 4 children of a Union veteran who were able to come to Peoria. And in turn, 2 of my students who were corresponding with members of that family went with me, along with their parents, to Southwest Missouri to put on a ceremony at their Civil War father's grave in West Fork, Arkansas, I guess it was. And so just wonderful. There were so many wonderful things that were happening. Well, as a result, my principal said to me one day, he of course got wind of what we were doing, and he said, Bill, he said to me, you know, Tim, he said, a lot of these kids, because most of these kids, Bill, who participated in this were from very economically disadvantaged backgrounds. And, you know, as the principal said, they hadn't had too many positive reasons to be getting ink in the local newspaper. So anyway, so he dispatched one of the reporters from the Peoria Journal-Star to do a feature on the kids. The article went out over the AP wire, and after that, you know, it was picked up by a lot of the major dailies around the country, and we started to have reporters, columnists, feature writers from different major dailies who contacted us, who wanted to do their own stories on this project. And we had a gentleman who I'm sadly to say is now deceased, Jeff Zaslow from the Wall Street Journal, who used the students in 2 articles, replete with a lot of interviews, which weren't necessarily, not Bill, just focusing on their experience, but on the war experience in general. So they were part of a much bigger article. However, the Chicago Tribune ran an entire feature story on the students, as did the Washington Times. And so after these articles appeared in the major dailies across the country, then we had publishing companies who started to solicit us. And I'll never forget, Bill, one day, principal called me down to the office, and it was a gentleman calling from Nashville, Tennessee, with a publishing company. And he said, I was just wondering if you had thought about this as a book. And I said to him, well, I guess I really hadn't, because we were still in kind of what I consider the embryonic stages of this. We'd been doing this for a few months, but there was so much more we had to do. So I hadn't really thought about it in terms of a book. And he said, well, I think you're going to have enough material here for a book, especially with the fact that the vast majority of these Civil War children, both men and women, were themselves World War II veterans. And he said that's such a unique concept. The very next day, though, I had a call from St. Petersburg, Florida, from the publisher at Vandermeer Press, excellent publishing company in St. Pete. The gentleman introduced himself and indicated that their main office had been located in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., for several years. And this gentleman still received copies of the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Times every day. And because he received the Washington Times every day, he had seen the article that this Martha Bolts had written. And he said, you know, Tim, this is really a fascinating story. He said, I was wondering if you'd ever thought about this in terms of a book. And I said, Yeah, Mr. Brown, I thought about it yesterday. And so we ended up meeting, and later in the year, and I signed a contract with Vandermeer Press. The book came out several years ago, and they just printed a modest 6,000 copies, thinking that I think that would do well if it were to sell 6,000. Well, it sold 6,000, and it went into a second print, and now it's in a third print, and it's sold in excess of 10,000 copies. Albeit now the copies are in paperback. I'm sorry to say, but that's okay. We're still glad to have it in print. And with the demise of Mr. Upham,
that's a really big, that's a really big, sale for these days. I mean, books don't.
And I'll tell you why it turned out so well too, Bill. Another aspect of this, I thought because of the work that the students had done, and there was a handful of them really who worked very, very hard. And so we set it up so that most of the royalties from the sale of the book went back into a trust fund for these students who worked on it. And so it benefited a half a dozen of these students very, very nicely in helping to defray a lot of the expenses that they incurred in college.
That's great. That's great. And you ran across so many little stories. I remember you told me that you became aware of one of a son of Jefferson Davis who fought for the Union Army. I mean, that's
yes, and that is part of. I'm going to pull that out right now if I can. I'm going to go to the Civil War Fathers, Sons of the Civil War and World War II book, and I will look that up. Bill's referring to once again Governor Upham's eulogy. He was asked to eulogize Jefferson Davis at the time of Davis's passing, and I think Bill Jefferson Davis died maybe in 1882. Does that probably sound
right? Yep.
Maybe that probably sounds right. If you could bear with me, I'm just looking this up right now.
We both knew in New York, Alexander Stevens, who was a great nephew, I guess, of Jeff Davis. Number 2 as vice president, Alexander Stevens.
Yes. I didn't realize this until the other day, Bill, but I was reading something about Alexander Hamilton that someone in the Confederacy ran into him on a train during the Civil War and couldn't believe that it was actually the vice president of the Confederacy, because he was only about, he said, my gosh, he said, this man just looks so shriveled. He was only about 4'11" or 5 feet tall. Maybe weighed about 110, 120 pounds. And he couldn't believe, that was the second most important governmental person in the Confederacy. Bill, here's the eulogy that Jefferson Davis, which Mr. Upham gave, and this was in 1882.
And then immediately afterwards, I'm going to ask you to promo Nick Inman, who's going to be joining us in just a few minutes on the line. And and that story is just, it just gets out of control. But hit me with the Jeff Davis.
Right. Okay. At the request of some of my companions, I have been asked to give my experience with Jeff Davis and his confinement at Fort Monroe. In the summer of 1866, I was appointed second lieutenant in the 5th United States Artillery, and owing to some error at the War Department, order assigning me to station and battery was not received, and my leave of absence expired, and I began to feel that the government had lost sight of me. Still, the great government went along just the same. I learned that my battery was somewhere in the Gulf Coast, but did not know whether at Key West, at Tortugas, Barrancas, or Pensacola Harbor. Feeling it somewhat incumbent upon me to look up the battery, as I did not believe it would search for me, I went to the city of New York, arriving Saturday, and stopping at the Astor House. Whilst there, I met Colonel Parker of General Grant's staff, and he advised me to report to the War Department at Washington. Still being anxious to find the government, I went to Washington, and the next day reported to General Williams at the War Department. After he had looked over the records, I was recognized as part of the military army of the service, and informed that the headquarters of the 5th Artillery were at Fort Monroe, and ordered to report at once. I modestly requested permission to remain in Washington a day for the purchase of the necessary outfit for an officer, but was peremptorily told to leave Washington that morning and by the first train. Finding a hack in the street, I contracted with the driver for 50 cents. In case he missed it, he got $1. Of course, he missed the train and got $1. However, I left Washington that evening in time for the boat for Fort Monroe. Rising early the next morning and donning my uniform, I went to report at the post. Reporting for duty, General Burton, commanding officer of the garrison, kindly told me I had better stay at Fort Monroe and get acquainted with my brother officers before joining my battery at Barrancas, and he detailed me to assist the adjutant, Colonel Piper, and take my tour as officer of the guard in charge of ex-Confederate President Jefferson Davis. This was very pleasant to me, as part of my arduous duties was to escort Miss Nellie, the daughter of the general, horseback riding over to the Hamptons. Now here's where he talks about Davis. Jeff Davis, at the time I reported at Fort Monroe, was living with his family and Mrs. Davis in one of the casemates, just the same quarters as other officers were occupying. During the day, Mr. Davis had parole of garrison from reveille until retreat, just the same freedom of garrison as any of us, except to go outside the fort. At retreat, he reported to the officer of the guard and occupied his quarters, which were on second floor of Carroll Hall, which was a large two-story frame building occupied as quarters mostly by the bachelor officers of the garrison. The quarters of Davis's consisted of 2 rooms. The cell was merely a room with the window grated. The door opening into the officer of the guard's room was a grated door, with a blanket hung in front, which was to cut off the light. The officer of the guard at any time during the night could lift the blanket, look through the door, and see whether Mr. Davis was occupying his cot. The officer of the guard was not permitted to leave his room during his tour of duty. Mrs. Davis was allowed to go and visit with her husband until tattoo, and then return to her quarters, usually accompanied by the sergeant of the guard. She was quite haughty and imperious in her manner, and barely replied to any of the salutations from the officers. One evening, she came accompanied by an elderly gentleman from Richmond, Virginia. I asked her for a pass for his entrance. She replied that the gentleman was there by authority of President Johnson. I refused his entrance and told Mrs. Davis that, not being acquainted with President Johnson, any orders he had for me, he usually communicated through the commanding officer of the garrison, General Burton. Having to stay in the next room, I could hear the conversation between them. She usually called him Jeff. After Mrs. Davis's departure, I usually went in and passed the hours until after midnight with Mr. Davis. With his long grizzly hair and uncut beard, and dressed in an old calico dressing gown, I never saw him, but it seemed to call to mind old John Brown, though I cannot trace a single feature of resemblance between them. But I presume the remembrance of John Brown's captivity at Harper's Ferry and his execution brought to mind the comparison. Were his acts of treason and rebellion? What were Jeff Davis's? And then the sentence is incomplete. The room was furnished with an iron bedstead, which is familiar to a great many of us, a wooden table, and 2 chairs. Usually upon the table was a box of tobacco and some pipes. In sitting on opposite sides with our feet resting on the table, we would sit and chat until both of us were sleepy. As a companion and a man to talk with Mr. Davis, he was very pleasant and social. He was full of reminiscences and stories of the Army, familiar with all parts of Wisconsin, having crossed the state twice by trail from Green Bay, and once from Milwaukee to Prairie du Chien. The topography of the state was more familiar to him than to me, who had lived nearly all my life in Wisconsin. He could tell me the meaning of all the Indian names of this locality, gave me a history of the building of the post at Prairie du Chien, stories of West Point and Army life. And never to me did he indulge in any bitterness of reflection upon anyone. Political topics were never touched upon between us, and I presume if they had been, we should have been in immediate disagreement. After staying until midnight or until Mr. Davis got sleepy, I would retire from the room that was used as a cell to the officer of the guard's room, lock the door, and then if I had any letters to write, attend to them. And having a very comfortable rocking chair to sit in, after putting the key to Mr. Davis's room in my pocket, and knowing that I was surrounded by a guard of 8 men in charge of a sergeant, at this day I am free to confess that an interval of unconsciousness would occur, not returning until somebody came in and shook me by the shoulder and said, "Lieutenant, it is reveille." I would say to the sergeant, quote, "Dismiss the guard, unlock Mr. Davis's door, and pass rapidly down the porch to my quarters in the same building and go to bed." During my leave of absence in 1866, I visited, listen to this, Bill, I visited the Menominee Reservation at Kishana and met a squaw named Mrs. Davis and a son of whom Jeff Davis was the father. The son enlisted from Wisconsin and fought on the Union side and was and is a good, responsible Indian. Billy noticed that he talked about him in the present, is a good, responsible Indian. It never occurred to my mind when in confinement at Richmond in 1861 and 62, and when the Confederate president looked in upon us, that sometime I should lock his nibs up for the night and be held responsible for his safekeeping during my tour of duty. The fortunes of war are as varied and startling as the changes of the kaleidoscope, and the form and figure of the next change no one can tell. This change from prisoner to keeper I had never dreamed of. Finally, after taking an acquaintance, as they say, in the mountains of Tennessee with the officers of the garrison, and having a disagreement with Colonel DuPont, who, being my superior officer, placed me under arrest, much to my regret, I was ordered to Fort Barrancas at Pensacola Harbor.
Yeah, pretty. Yeah, I had never run across any mention that Confederate President Davis had a son fighting for the Union. But Nick, also Tim, while you were speaking, I believe our guest Nick came on, and I was wondering if you might be able to include him in this conversation.
Tim, you were doing such a great job of reading that. I was mesmerized.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. If I can give a short introduction for Nicholas. Nicholas is just a wonderful gentleman who contacted me out of the blue one day a couple of years ago in wintertime and informed me about a wonderful event which he holds every year in southwestern Missouri in the town of Marshfield called the Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival. And Billy, to be able to condense this for you, and then we'll let Nicholas elaborate on it. This began, I believe, about 13 or 14 years ago, and every year the children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren of American presidents descend on this tiny town. I say tiny, it's about 6,000. This town of Marshfield, Missouri. They come together for this Cherry Blossom Festival. But the festival encompasses more than simply the gathering of these offspring of American presidents. It is expanded now to cover a number of interesting people from American history, both who have worked in capacities where they came into contact with the president and those beyond. He has one of Nicholas's panels the last few years that he has been composed of people who have worked at the White House in various capacities. And this could include chefs, a couple of pastry chefs, for instance, speech writers, just running the gamut of different occupations relative to the presidency. Last year, one of the most interesting speakers, just a dynamic speaker, when we talked about an association with a president, was a gentleman by the name of Jim Lavelle. And Bill, you might not be familiar with that name, but when I start to describe this gentleman, you are going to know exactly who it is because he has one of the most iconic faces in American history. Mr. Lavelle was the law enforcement officer in Dallas at the
Yep.
police station the Sunday after, the murder of President Kennedy, when Lee Harvey Oswald was to be transferred from that locale to another. And Jim Lavelle was the law enforcement officer who was handcuffed to Lee Harvey Oswald when Jack Ruby came forward and shot Mr. Oswald.
And Nick, before Nick starts, Tim, I just have to say that my introduction to the Missouri Cherry Festival, Cherry Blossom Festival, which I have not been to in person yet, I had hoped to go last year, was a phone call from you, Tim, and you said, I'm here having lunch with, I think it was Nikita Khrushchev's granddaughter or something, Eisenhower's granddaughter, and Zuzu
yes.
from It's a Wonderful Life. Or Tinkerbell.
Yeah, we just an exercise had just finished, Bill. It was a wonderful symposium, which included, it was a war symposium, including Mary Eisenhower, the granddaughter of Ike, the daughter of John, along with, and I'm sorry to say, the late Jonathan Sands, who was a great-grandson of Winston Churchill's, and the son of Nikita Khrushchev, Sergei Khrushchev. And so afterwards, Mr. Sands is doing a book signing with me. I have Mr. Sands doing a book signing on one side of me, and Eddie from the Munsters doing another book signing.
And you had him sign a book for me.
Anyway, so
Nick.
without further ado, I just, because we haven't had a chance to even touch upon the fact that in addition to all of these outstanding, interesting people of historic notoriety, the festival now encompasses people from yesteryear, from Hollywood, from the big screen, television, some of the most iconic personalities. This is the all-American festival. If this isn't a slice of Americana, I don't know what is. And I hope that some of the people, Bill, in the New York metro area who are listening to this podcast tonight will be able to come back and attend the festival in April. I'd now like to present to you the gentleman who was responsible for putting all of this together, the Reverend Nicholas Inman.
Well, thank you. My goodness, what an introduction. But I hope, you're exactly right, I hope that the listeners will be able to gravitate to Marshfield, which we call the center of the nation, the heartbeat of the nation, to learn about their history. We've watched as many across the nation, they don't learn a complete in-depth view of American history anymore. And so it's wonderful to be able to come to a location that's central to the country and learn about history, our history, for several days. And most of the events that we have are free and open to the public because we want people to come and bring their children and to learn from primary sources of history, whether it's a daughter of a Civil War veteran, a widow of a Civil War veteran, which we actually have one living in our town.
Did you hear that, Billy?
Yeah. Or, a descendant of, as Tim mentioned, an American president, or someone who's been a part of our culture. So we say we put history in a blender and it blows up for 3 days in various capacities. This year we have panels on Vietnam and World War II, the Reagan administration, working in the White House, just a whole gamut of interest of history. And what I have found in these 14 years, not everybody had a wonderful experience learning American history. I was very fortunate to have an American history teacher who brought history to life. But if you had a teacher that ruined that experience and history was just a bunch of dates and names and became boring to you, you might not ever pay attention to it. But what I have found over the years, people are drawn to iconic television stars, maybe the stars of the Andy Griffith Show or the Waltons or Little House on the Prairie, which we have regularly every year. They'll come to see them, and then they'll find them staying for a panel about the presidency or something, and they'll say to me later, I hadn't really planned to stay for that, but I stayed, and I was fascinated with that. And boy, I always thought history was boring, but that was really neat. And then you have an audience member who wants to return every year. We call them Cherry Festers. And the Cherry Festers have become a big, large family, really, and some of these festival goers and attendees or participants have been attending all 14 years. And it's a wonderful opportunity, as Tim alluded to hear and to get to know and actually visit with people who shape the history of our country.
Nick, you mentioned about being able to bring history to these folks, but I wanted to say that history came to you several years ago. Billy, excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt, but there was something that Nicholas said that I think, Bill, you'll probably be very interested in, and that is the opportunity that Nicholas had, I guess probably about 1990, 1991 maybe, to meet President George Herbert Walker Bush.
Yes. For a town of 6,000 people, we've had two presidential visits. The first by President Truman, and then later in 91 on the 4th of July for then President George H.W. Bush and Barbara. He was campaigning, of course, and in fact, he's the one that coined the phrase during his visit to our town that we were the heartbeat of the nation. And so it was that moment in the parade as a little fourth grader that I yelled out at Mrs. Bush, and she waved at me. And from that moment on, I was in love with American history, the presidency, everything about it. I told Mrs. Bush years later that moment led to the festival. She said, if I'd have known what it would have caused, I would have never waved at you.
that sounds very much like Barbara Bush. And,
yes,
and
you got it.
How many progeny of presidents have you had over the 14 years? And how many presidents have been represented?
I think we've had 40 or 41 altogether in the 14 years. Of course, not all of them at the same time, and sometimes just like the Bush administration, when the Bush twins visit, we get two administrations, actually three, with Barbara Bush's connection to Franklin Pierce. So every once in a while we're lucky and get somebody that has connections to two presidents, which is even better. But we've had, I think, 40 or 41.
And am I right in understanding that most of the guests that come to the festival, and it's many thousands at this point, stay in the homes of people in the town?
Yes. Now, our VIP guests, because we are a small town, we fill all the bed and breakfast in the hotels very quickly with VIP guests. So the first year of the festival, I thought, we're asking these people from across the country, these VIP guests, to come to a place they've never heard of and stay with people that they've never met. This is going to be interesting. But what I didn't expect from that is the friendships that would unfold. One, it caused our local residents to brush up on their history. If you're keeping a grandchild of Harry Truman, you're going to learn all you can to have an intelligent conversation about the Truman administration. And then that gave the VIP guest a local tour guide. And some of our guests, you're exactly right, have stayed now in the same home all 14 years. And some of those host families that we've had in Marshfield have in turn gone to visit the guests that they keep every year. And they've been very close. And through the years, we've watched as host family members have passed away, and those VIP guests have come back for funerals or sent flowers, and they've become extended family. And I never expected that to happen.
And what I find amazing is that you've never really, pushed publicity on it. It's just something that you do. You don't do it with a lot of fanfare, and it just happens. It seems that people know it, understand what a special thing it is, and kind of keep it to themselves. Who are some of the people that you had last year, for example? And I know it's a little early this year, but do you know when I ask who you might have this year, and I guess who you had last year?
Yes. Well, this year we have Richard Thomas is coming for the first time, who of course was John Boy on the Waltons. We are having the first ever joint reunion of the Walton and Little House on the Prairie cast, which will be very interesting. Little House on the Prairie is celebrating its 45th anniversary. So it'll be really interesting to watch those casts who have a lot of the same fans have a joint reunion. We always honor 6 famous Missourians during the festival with a star on the Missouri Walk of Fame, and we're excited to have Ed Asner with us this year. Of course, Ed Asner has witnessed so much history. And then I've mentioned Harry Truman several times now, but Truman's grandson, Clifton, is doing a one-man play on the life of his grandfather, which I think will be very exciting. And then to show how diverse we are, Randy Travis will be back with us this year. We've joined forces with the Randy Travis Foundation. This will be the second year, and we're excited that he will be there, as well as the living cast members of It's a Wonderful Life, several from the Andy Griffith Show, just a whole range of people from different aspects of history that I think your listeners would enjoy, and lots of presidential relatives. I think so far we're about 30 administrations being represented thus far this year, and I'm sure we'll hear from more as we go along.
And you're talking about just for this year, this coming year?
Yes, that's this April.
That is remarkable. You know, on the cultural icons, and I'm interested both in the cultural icons and the political figures, of course.
Yes.
But I mean, you're probably used to this because you've done it for so long. Hopefully, you're not. But to those of us who are outsiders, what those figures mean to us in such a personal way is hard to describe. You know, little Zuzu or Waltons. I mean, those are our childhood. Those are very special people and moments to us, and it must be overwhelming to them, yet to be approached by people that feel that they've known them all their lives.
Well, and that's right. And I have a little girl who's 10, and she's grown up, of course, helping with the Cherry Blossom Festival. And I think about, to her, this has become, commonplace to have breakfast with Zuzu or dinner with Aaron from the Waltons. And, she's grown up with these people as, intimate friends. And Charlene Darling from the Andy Griffith Show brings her a birthday gift at the festival every year. And I have to constantly pinch myself to think this is happening in our town. And these people are iconic people. They're the most.
Isn't that just amazing? Yeah.
It's amazing to me, and I have to remind her all the time, Reagan, this is a very important piece of our history that you may not understand now, but someday you're going to look back and think, my goodness, I was brushing, shoulders with history. I'm often asked about who my favorite guest has been in all the years. And, we've had Laura Bush and Linda Johnson and just gobs of wonderful guests over the years. But the most iconic person I think we've ever had was Thelma Lou from the Andy Griffith Show, or Betty Lynn is her real name. And Thelma Lou was, of course, Barney's girlfriend on the Andy Griffith Show. And she attended the first few years of the festival when her health was better. And people's reaction to her was just unbelievable. It was like they were meeting a relative they hadn't seen in years. And grown men would cry. And it was just amazing. And I knew then that we had hit on something. She attended the festival because she was from Kansas City, Missouri. So we had honored her with a star on the Walk of Fame. And I thought, if people have this kind of a reaction to the people they've grown up with, that's part of our history, and we have to include that. And so I always thank Betty Lynn for that, because it's brought many wonderful memories watching people meet Zuzu and other people. And to add this, if I might, about Zuzu, Carolyn Grimes lived in Osceola, Missouri for many years, of course, who made the role of Zuzu famous. And this year at the Cherry Blossom Festival, we've had a problem in our area of homeless teens. And so our community came together around last Cherry Blossom Festival time to try to solve that. And we put together what we called Zuzu's House, which is going to be a home, a multifamily home for these children to provide them a safe environment. And Carolyn, little Zuzu, has served as the honorary chairperson. And Dr. Janine Roos, who played little Violet Bick, who flirts with George Bailey behind the soda fountain counter, is a clinical psychologist in Los Angeles. And she's on the board of Zuzu's House. And they're going to be dedicating Zuzu's House at the festival this year. So
it reminds me, when I got chills up my spine, and Tim, I'd love to hear how you experienced it when you first arrived. But I went right to Field of Dreams in my mind, when, one of the narratives in Field of Dreams is about how you can go back and see your heroes and the people you cheered, and it seems like you've captured that in a really special way. What was that like?
Bill, I was just going to add, and then I'll let you get back to Nick. And Nick, this was my feeling when you were so kind to invite me 2 years ago. There's a wonderful human interest story behind virtually everyone who attends this.
That's very true. Yes. And back to your question ties into that, of course. It's so phenomenal to get to be with these people, but then for them to take an interest in our community and to feel like they are a part of it. It's a reunion or a vacation spot they come home to every year. And so for someone like Zuzu to say, I want to be a part of your community and help, that permanently ties them to us. And we are very pleased that they want to give back to the community that they feel has given them so many years of enjoyment. And, we even had a marriage because of the Cherry Blossom Festival. Our newspaper editor married one of Thomas Jefferson's descendants because they met at the Cherry Blossom Festival. And I had the honor of performing the nuptials, and it was a very special experience. So the Cherry Blossom Festival just brought a whole bunch of stuff.
And you've had people from both sides of Jefferson's family, right? Did you have Sally Henning's family?
Yeah.
Also, yeah.
Mm-hmm. In fact, the two descendants that originally came to the Cherry Blossom Festival the first year, representing both sides, those two individuals had never met one another, although they were cousins, and they've become close friends. And so that was very special. And, I'll stress this, speaking of both sides, we do that with politics, too, during the festival. We always say everybody leaves their politics at home because many of these descendants are still very active in the parties of which their presidential relative was involved. So we leave those at home and we come and celebrate the history that unites us and not the history that divides us. And it's kind of nice to know somewhere in the country that happens.
Bill, you would love one of the panels that they have had in past years is composed of Jefferson Davis's great-great-grandson, Bertram Hayes Davis, and Lynn Jackson, who is a great-great-granddaughter of Dred Scott.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow.
We see lots of healing.
Very powerful.
Yeah. I call them healing moments of American history.
No, that's amazing. Can I? We only have another couple of minutes, and I'm going to beg both of you to come up another time to talk some more. But in the meantime, could you let our listeners know how they can learn both about the Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival and then Tim about Civil War Fathers? So, Reverend, why don't you go first, Tim? If you could let them know about the book.
Sure. If anyone is interested in obtaining a copy of Civil War Fathers, there are two things you can do. One, you can get it wherever books are sold. You can order it through Barnes & Noble. You could go online and order it through Amazon. Or if you would like an autographed copy, Bill, folks can also contact me. That number is 309-679-0403. That's 309-679-0403. And otherwise, just look it up on Amazon, or you can contact the publishing company at Vandermeer Press. And that phone number is 727-556-0950. 727-556-0950. Don't feel badly if anyone would like to contact me for an autographed copy, though, that's fine. Please don't call, though, after 10 o'clock, because I think everyone would have to understand. My wife is a school teacher. She goes to bed kind of early, and she wouldn't really relish a call at 12 o'clock.
Or, Tim, they can come to the Cherry Blossom Festival and meet you in person and get a copy, which the Cherry Blossom Festival is the last weekend in April each year, and you can learn more about that at the festival website, which is cherryblossompfest.com, or you can visit on Facebook, Missouri Cherry Blossom Festival in Marshfield, Mo. And there we post who's visiting and the latest schedule, and all of the tickets for the meals of the festival go on sale on President's Day every year. It's a good way to remember that. And if they have questions to call, the number is 808-345-4975. I'll give that to you again. It's 808-345-4975. We would love to have you in Marshfield.
Reverend
Folks,
Nicholas,
please do join us.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being on for immediate release. It was a joy,
yeah.
And we really hope to have both of you back certainly before the Cherry Blossom Festival this year. So thank you so much for your time. Yeah, we could go on for hours. Thank you.
Yes. Take care.
Billy, thank you so much. And I just wanted to say thank you for being such a wonderful friend all of these years. And we can talk a little bit more about that and about the wonderful experience that you afforded me of being able to visit with your dad for the last 5 years of his life. And we can discuss that at another time.
It's a date. Deal.
Tim, hope to see you in Missouri, Billy.
Very good. Hope to
Thanks,
be there.
Billy.
Thank you so much.
Bye, Nick.
Thank you. Bye, Tim. Bye-bye.
Bye.